Hi, and welcome to DrupalBrief. This is an AI-generated summary of another video, podcast, or blog post. If you want to learn more about what's being discussed here, then please go check out the source. This podcast is produced by the team at Drupal Forge. Drupal Forge is the new #1 open-source development and hosting platform. It has all the functionality of the expensive platforms, but at very affordable prices. If you're looking for a new hosting provider, contact us for a demo before you get locked in. Okay, that's it. Make sure to click subscribe, and here we go.
Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever thought, Drupal's super powerful, but wow, sometimes that complexity feels like a really high wall to climb?
Or maybe, how does a project this big, this global, actually keep itself going and really empower everyone involved everywhere?
Exactly. Well, today we're diving deep into two initiatives that are, frankly, groundbreaking. They're really reshaping Drupal to tackle those exact kinds of challenges.
Sounds interesting. What do we got?
Okay, first up, the Modeler API. It's a new visual toolkit, and it looks set to pretty much revolutionize how we define and represent business logic inside Drupal.
A visual toolkit for logic. Okay.
And then second, we're looking at something really ambitious, the International Drupal Federation Initiative. Basically, a whole new plan to reimagine how Drupal is governed globally for the long haul, and for truly inclusive leadership.
Wow. Okay. Two pretty different areas, but both sound fundamental.
They really are. So our mission today is to get past the buzzwords. We want to show you what these things really are, why they're happening right now, and crucially, what impact they're likely to have on you and, well, the whole Drupal world.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how they both kind of circle back to the same core ideas, right? Making Drupal easier to get into, more accessible, and making sure it's viable for the future. Feels like the ecosystem is really maturing.
Couldn't agree more. So let's start with that Modeler API. This kicked off March 2025. Jürgen Huss is behind it. Name probably rings a bell.
Oh, yeah. ECA, the Gen Admin theme. Definitely influential work.
Right. So the core idea, the heart of it, is to give us a common visual way, a toolkit, to define business logic across loads of different Drupal functions.
So not just one specific area.
No. Think bigger. Responding to events, yeah, but also building complex migrations, even creating, AI agents, all using a similar visual approach.
That's the key bit, isn't it? Standardizing the visual language for this stuff. So instead of devs coding everything or site builders wrestling with config for every little piece of logic.
You get this uniform drag and drop interface.
Exactly. Which, potentially opens the door for a lot more people to actually interact with and build on Drupal's backend power.
That's a really crucial point. And for listeners who've been with us for a while, you might remember we talked about ECA event condition action.
Episodes 375 and 402, I think.
That's the one. ECA was huge because it let you build workflows as visual diagrams using that bpmn.io interface.
Right, the business process modeling notation. Standard stuff.
So the Modeler API, think of it as an abstraction layer on top of that idea.
Okay, so it takes that visual interface.
The familiar, intuitive way of defining logic and lets you apply it to other things beyond just ECA workflows.
Ah, okay. So it's like taking that successful visual idea and saying, hey, let's use this everywhere it makes sense.
Precisely, making it universally applicable, potentially.
And you mentioned its origin, DrupalCon Atlanta.
Yeah, that's where it really sparked. Jürgen, Benji Fischer, Chris Weber. They used a contribution day, apparently.
So a collaborative effort.
Totally. They saw how new versions of ECA, AI agents, and bpmn.io could work together. And the story goes, they actually demoed using the bpmn modeler to define an AI agent visually.
Wow. That must have been a real aha moment for people there.
Yeah.
Seeing it applied beyond just traditional workflows.
Definitely. Which leads us straight into the real-world impact, right? For site builders, this could be massive.
How so?
Well, think about managing something like data migrations. Usually that means writing tons of YAML files, right? Drupal's configuration format can be pretty painstaking.
Yes. Complex, error-prone sometimes.
Right. Now imagine doing that visually, dragging and dropping to map fields, transform data, a bit like how the feeds module works, maybe. Or web forms conditional logic builder.
Yeah, I see. So it makes those complex tasks much more approachable, less risk maybe when deploying, and more team members could potentially handle it.
Exactly. And crucially, this visual setup, it's still properly backed by Drupal's config entities and YAML underneath. So it's robust, portable, developers can still dive in if needed.
So it lowers the technical barrier quite dramatically for stuff that used to be pretty developer heavy. But you mentioned a surprise benefit too for business users.
Yeah, this is interesting. The power of using bpmn.io, because it's an industry standard visual language, is actually huge for communication.
How do you mean?
Well, because it's visual, it's kind of inherently self-documenting. You can literally sit down with a business stakeholder, show them the visual flow of how their requirement is built.
And they can actually understand it.
Yeah.
And give meaningful feedback.
Exactly. It bridges that communication gap. Older tools, maybe like the rules module, could sometimes feel like a black box to non-technical folks. This is much more transparent.
That transparency is massive.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. And looking ahead, what other possibilities does this unlock?
Well, because the Modeler API is its own separate thing, it means you could potentially have different user interfaces plugging into it.
Oh, interesting. So not just bpmn.io.
Potentially, yeah. People are talking about using modern frameworks like React, maybe Drupal's own experience builder, looking at tools like N8N or WKDO for inspiration.
So making the interface even more user-friendly or context-specific down the line?
Could be. And what's also pretty cool is that it brings Drupal's form API into this visual world.
The form API, how does that work?
Well, imagine being able to visually add logic to forms, use the States API to show or hide fields based on selections, maybe even change field descriptions on the fly.
All without writing custom code. Just using the visual modeler.
That seems to be the potential, yeah. Creating really bespoke user experiences much more easily.
That adaptability sounds key for long-term buy-in. Keeps it relevant as UIs evolve. But okay, what are the catches? Any challenges?
Well, yeah, there's a key one. The module itself, Modeler API, it's actively maintained, has security coverage. There's an Alpha 3 release for Drupal 11.2+, so that's good. But the documentation specifically for the Modeler API itself is still, pretty early days. Still developing.
Ah, okay. Documentation is always critical for adoption, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially for something aiming for wider use.
Absolutely. But maybe some reassurance here. The ECA module, which uses the same visual approach, actually has really extensive documentation and a great Slack channel for support.
Okay, so there's a good model to follow,
Yeah.
a precedent for good support within that community.
Exactly. It suggests they understand how important clear guidance is, so hopefully the Modeler API docs will follow suit.
Makes sense.
Okay, so we've just dug into how the Modeler API is changing how we build stuff in Drupal, making it more visual, more accessible.
Right.
But what about the bigger picture? Like, who builds Drupal? Who governs it? Let's switch gears completely now and talk about the International Drupal Federation Initiative.
Okay, the Federation. This sounds like a big one.
It really is. It's this comprehensive effort to totally revise Drupal's governance on a global scale. The main goal. Move away from the current structure where the Drupal Association, the DA, is basically a U.S. nonprofit.
Based in the U.S. legally.
And establish a truly global model. Shared responsibility for the really core stuff, Drupal.org, the servers, trademarks, and even new things like Drupal CMS, Drupal AI initiatives.
Wow. So this isn't just tweaking the rules. This is a fundamental restructuring.
Yeah.
Trying to make the governance match the reality of Drupal's global community.
That's exactly it, because the community has long outgrown that original U.S.-centric legal box, right?
Absolutely. So where did this specific push come from, and why now? You said it kicked off officially May 20th, 2025.
Yeah, but the idea itself, the real catalyst, came from a DA board retreat back at DrupalCon Atlanta in March 2025.
Okay, so what happened at that retreat? What was the aha moment that made them think, right, we need this fundamental shift?
The big driver, apparently, was the need for better financial sustainability, long-term financial health.
Money, okay. How does restructuring help with that?
Specifically, it was about tapping into European funding. In Europe, open source is increasingly seen as, digital public infrastructure. There's significant potential funding there.
I see. But the U.S. nonprofit structure was maybe a barrier to accessing that.
That seems to be the core of it. The realization was, look, to really sustain Drupal long-term, especially with this European potential, you simply have to bring global voices formally into the governance structure.
Even though the board itself was already quite international.
Yeah, apparently over half the board members were already non-US based. But the legal foundation, the nonprofit entity itself, was still American. And that mismatch created this, well, they called it an existential question about the future.
Okay, that makes sense. A strategic imperative, really. So this federation model, let's unpack that. How is it actually different from the current DA?
Right now, the DA is a U.S. 501c3 nonprofit. The board, more or less, appoints new members.
Okay, standard nonprofit board structure.
The federation model is completely different. Think like the YMCA or the Red Cross.
Okay, how so?
It would be an international nonprofit, probably based somewhere like Belgium, made up of member organizations. And those members would be the local and national Drupal associations from around the world.
So the local associations become the members of the international body.
Exactly. And those member associations would then decide who serves on the international board.
Okay, that's a huge shift. It makes those local groups, the national associations, suddenly much, much more important. They get a direct say in the global leadership.
Right. Power shifts closer to the ground, to the communities themselves.
So if this goes ahead, what happens to the things the current DA does? And what about the U.S. entity itself? Does it just disappear?
Good question. A lot of the current DA programs, think like the Drupal Certified Partner Program or maybe general membership schemes, those could potentially be run by the local associations directly.
Fostering closer ties within regions. Makes sense.
Yeah. And the big global stuff, managing Drupal.org servers, holding the trademarks for Drupal and DrupalCon, maybe leading international marketing that would likely shift to the new International Federation.
Okay, so what about the existing U.S. Drupal Association entity?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. It would almost certainly change, quite dramatically. It might become much more focused inward on supporting specifically North American needs.
Like what?
Maybe helping local camps in the US and Canada with websites or back office support, maybe connecting new contributors within North America, that kind of thing. Less global coordination, more regional support.
So a strategic decentralization. Some functions go local, core global stuff goes to the new federation, and the U.S. entity finds a new, more regional focus.
That seems to be the thinking. And it gives local associations much more ownership, too, like organizing DrupalCon Europe, for instance. The European associations would have a much more direct hand in that.
Precisely. Empowering the local level for local needs, while the federation handles the global constants.
But, okay, this sounds complex. What are the challenges, the trade-offs?
Well, one big one is just building critical mass. For this federation model to really work well, ideally you'd want a good number of strong local and national associations signing up as members.
How many are we talking?
The ideal number thrown around is maybe 10 to 14 active members, though realistically it could probably start with just 2 or 3 committed ones.
And is that base there? Are there enough strong local associations?
That's a potential hurdle. We know some local groups struggled a bit, post-COVID especially, so really cultivating and supporting that base of engaged member organizations is going to be crucial for the Federation to actually deliver on its promise.
Right, a big organizational lift. What about the governance itself? Managing all these different groups? Yeah, complexity is another factor. The legal structure they're looking at, this Belgium AISBL law, it's apparently quite flexible, which is good, but it does require things like an annual assembly of all the members and board elections based on that assembly.
It's standard international nonprofit stuff, but does that raise questions about fairness, representation?
Absolutely. That's a key discussion point. How do you balance, say, a single large association representing the U.S., potentially, against maybe multiple smaller associations representing different European countries? Getting the voting rights and representation fair in the bylaws is super important.
Tricky balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
And another potential issue. If local groups get more decision-making power, especially around things like branding or marketing.
Do you risk getting, like, national flavors of Drupal?
Yeah. Does the global brand get diluted? Does Drupal start to look and feel different depending on where you are?
Yeah, that's a valid concern, yeah. And it's kind of acknowledged as a trade-off you make for getting that more inclusive bottom-up governance.
So how would that be managed?
The idea is through clear agreements, global agreements outlining how the brand must be used consistently, setting quality standards, that kind of thing. It's about finding that balance. Local autonomy, but within a globally consistent framework.
Delicate balance indeed. Okay, this sounds like a massive undertaking. What's the timeline look like? Is this happening soon?
Well, the timeline they've set out is ambitious, very ambitious.
Oh.
They're aiming for an evaluation and potentially a board vote on whether to proceed by DrupalCon Vienna, which is likely Q3 or Q4 of 2025.
That's really soon.
It is. If approved, The absolute fastest launch for the Federation entity itself could be Q1 2026.
Wow.
But realistically, everyone expects the full realization, getting it fully operational, building up their robust membership base that's more likely a 12 to 24-month process.
Okay, so a quick start potentially, but a longer transition. How would that transition work practically? You can't just flip a switch.
No. The initial plan involves something called a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU. Basically, the new International Federation would initially contract the existing USDA to provide services.
Ah, like a company spin-off kind of model.
Exactly like that. It buys time. Time for assets, people, legal responsibilities to be transferred properly and smoothly from the U.S. entity to the new international one.
Makes sense. So who actually gets the final say? Who makes the decision to go ahead?
Legally, it has to be the current Drupal Association board. They control the assets, the trademarks, everything right now. So technically, they make the final vote.
Okay, so it's a top-down decision legally.
Legally, yes. But, and this is really important, the board has been very clear they are committed to engaging the community broadly, especially the leaders of local associations.
Yeah.
And they've basically said they will only move forward if enough local associations commit to becoming inaugural members of this new federation.
Ah. So effectively, the local associations hold the key. Their commitment is the green light.
That's the message. It gives the local communities a really powerful voice in whether this massive shift actually happens. No commitment from enough locals, no federation.
That's a significant check and balance.
Right.
And how else is the wider community being involved beyond just the local association leaders?
There's quite a bit going on. There's a dedicated working group, an advisory council, a big project page up on Drupal.org with all the details and updates.
Okay.
And a very active Slack channel, too. The idea seems to be encouraging local groups to discuss things among themselves, reach some kind of consensus, and then have a representative bring that collective feedback into the official channels.
So trying to foster that bottom-up influence, even on what is ultimately a board decision.
Seems like it, yeah. Okay, so who? We've covered a lot of ground there. We've really explored how Drupal is evolving from, well, two pretty critical angles.
Definitely. From the modular API, making development more visual and accessible,
all the way to the International Drupal Federation Initiative, which is trying to forge this more sustainable, more globally representative way of governing the whole project.
Quite the transformation,
yeah,
potentially on both fronts.
Absolutely. So you, our listener, should now be, hopefully, exceptionally well-informed about these really critical developments, things that aren't just tweaking Drupal, but actually reshaping its future, maybe even its core identity.
And having this knowledge, understanding the strategy behind both the tech changes and the community structure changes, it really gives you those insights that, often only insiders get to hear. It helps you see where Drupal's heading.
So here's something to chew on as we wrap up. As Drupal works on strengthening this global foundation and at the same time empowers its community with these innovative new visual tools, what new kinds of collaboration, what new open source breakthroughs do you think might become possible?
Okay, we're done. To close off this podcast, I just wanted to remind you that this brief was a fully AI-generated summary, and we take no credit for the original content. If you want to learn more, then check out the source. This podcast is produced by the team at Drupal Forge. Drupal Forge is the new #1 open-source development and hosting platform. It has all the functionality of the expensive platforms, but at very affordable prices. If you're looking for a new hosting provider, contact us for a demo before you get locked in. And if you like this podcast, hit subscribe, post a link on social media, and recommend it to 2 friends. That's it. See you next time. Bye for now.